In this tutorial, we're going to look at how to create a refreshable report in Microsoft Excel with Reporting Manager by Babbage Systems. By the end of this tutorial, you should know how to create a data export in the cloud using Reporting Manager, create a reporting event to pull your exported data into Excel, use Smart Interval to pull historical data into your report, and refresh your report on a regular basis. This tutorial assumes that you have already downloaded Reporting Manager and installed it into Excel, and that you have already created a connection to Google Analytics. If you have not completed these steps, see the documentation and tutorials on how to do so in the Support Center. Let's take a look at the report we'll be building. This is a report for a menus website, and it has some basic traffic metrics that are presented on a weekly basis. We have the sessions, users, page view, and bounce rate with week-over-week comparisons. We also have a trend line for sessions that shows the last 52 weeks of data. And we also have a simple top pages report, which just lists the top pages that were accessed on the site last week. In order to power this presentation layer of our report, I'm going to create a hidden tab called Data. This tab will ultimately be hidden when we deliver the report, but to start, we're going to drop in some dates. Now I've gone ahead and created a list of dates manually. The reason I've created my dates manually rather than using date dimensions exported by Google Analytics is because I might want to use my company's fiscal calendar to determine when weeks begin and end. Fiscal calendars can be configured in Analysis Engine within the web interface, which will affect your data exports that are pulled in through Reporting Manager. But if you configure a fiscal calendar, your actual week ranges will not line up with date dimensions or week dimensions that exist in Google Analytics. So we've decided here to enter the dates manually. So I have a list of dates, each representing a week of data, and I've pulled several of them beginning 52 weeks ago, because that's the first week I want data for in my report. Next, I'm going to click on Reporting Events. I want to make a distinction now between two types of assets that we're going to be working with. The first are called data exports. Data exports are definitions of reports that are pulled from Google Analytics that live in the cloud. So a data export is where you set which dimensions and metrics you want to pull from Google Analytics, which segments you want to use, what kind of sorting and filtering options are going to be applied to your data, and everything that has to do with actually getting your data out of Google Analytics. Those data exports are actually stored in the cloud so that you can provide access to other people who are going to be working with your report and collaborate on what the data export looks like. The second type of asset that we're going to be working with is the reporting event. Reporting events are connections between your Excel workbook and your data exports. Reporting events allow you to take your data exports, which are single pulls from Google Analytics, and turn them into regularly refreshable reporting pieces. We'll take a look at how this is done. So I've started by opening my list of reporting events, and right now I don't have any. And I'm going to start by creating a new event. I don't have any data exports already defined, but here is where I would be able to choose one if it existed. Instead, what I'm going to do is create a new data export. By clicking on the Create button, I now get the Data Export Editor window appearing on my screen. I'm going to start by giving my data export a name. I'm just going to call it Weekly Metrics, which is a nice descriptive name of what I'm trying to pull. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the tutorial, we are assuming that you've already created a connection to Google Analytics. So in the drop-downs, you'll see your connection is available there. Once you've chosen a connection, you can choose the web property and view in Google Analytics that you want to pull your data from. Next, we need to set a date range for our data export. Now, the data exports themselves are what we're going to be pulling at regular intervals. So every time I pull a data export for my weekly report, I want to pull the data from last week. So I'm going to choose a rolling date range of last week. As of today, pulled all at once. When I set these options, Reporting Manager will update and show you the date range you've selected as of today in this case, which, as we're in the week of March 1st, is the week of February 22nd, which is last week. Now, every time we run this data export, we're going to get data from last week. I'm not going to use a segment for this data export, but if I wanted a particular segment of my traffic, I have the option of choosing them here. All of the standard Google Analytics segments, as well as any custom segments you've created, are available within the segment selector. I'm not going to choose any dimensions for this data export either, but I am going to choose the list of metrics that we saw in the presentation layer of this report. They are users. Each time I'm clicking add, I can search the list for the metrics I want. Sessions. Page views. And bounce rate. I'm not going to worry about any of the advanced or formatting features of the data export because all I want in each of my rows is a simple table which shows me the users, sessions, page views, and bounce rate for the last week of data. So now that I've defined that, I'm going to click OK, and it's going to save my data export. Since I opened my data export from within a reporting event, it's automatically populated the reporting event with the data export I selected. Data exports are identified by their ID number, in this case 13. And when you enter an ID number, you will get the name of the data export shown here. I can also change this by using the select button, which will show my list of data exports, and I can choose the one I want, and it will populate in the reporting event. So, as we said, I've defined a data export, which is my single pull from Google Analytics that I want to define. But I want to pull this data for the last 52 weeks, and again every week that I want to deliver this report. So I'm going to use my reporting event settings to define how exactly I do that. In the spawn details section, I've chosen the cell B1, which is where I want my data to begin appearing. That's where my table is going to start. The worksheet I'm using is the data worksheet, and I want my data to spawn vertically. That is, every time I pull new data, I want it to appear below the previous week of data. Next, I'm going to use the Smart Interval feature to identify when my entire table of data begins and choose how this data is going to be pulled. So if I enable this feature, what I do is I begin by choosing the start date of my entire table of data. In this case, it's back in February 2014. I'm choosing the week of the 23rd. So this is going to choose February 23rd as the first week of data, and it's going to identify all of the intervals between then and now and pull the relevant data into place. Then, when I want to refresh the report on a regular basis, the Smart Interval feature will recognize that I've already filled the relevant weeks of data up until then, and then pull only the new data that is needed based on the current date. Because I'm spawning my data vertically into a table, I want to include column headers, but I only want them to appear on the first interval. That is, I want my users, sessions, page views, and bounce rate titles to be up here, but I don't want them repeated every week I have data. I just want my data to load in a single row every time. So once I've chosen those settings, I click OK, save my reporting event, and my list of reporting events is now saved. Now, if I run this reporting event, what Smart Interval is going to do is determine what date ranges are left to be pulled, and in this case, it's all of them. And it's going to begin requesting that data through the data export from Google Analytics. So you'll see the data begins to populate as each week is pulled. Pulling the historical data is the longest part of this process, but it allows you to easily pull all of the data into your export. I'm going to grab a cup of coffee and wait till this is done. So once my reporting events are finished generating, you'll see that no errors have occurred and that all of my data is now in place. Smart Interval pulled up until last week and populated the data for every week between the start of my Smart Interval and now. Now that this data is in place, I can go ahead and link my front-end presentation layer of this report to the data layer and start to populate some of that data. Once I've done so, I have a second piece of this report, my top pages little reportlet here. And so we're going to create a reporting event for that as well. In this case, I'm going to choose the cell H1 to load that table in. I'm going to open my reporting events and create a new event. In this case, I'm also going to create a new data export. And I'm going to call it my top pages last week data export. I'm going to choose the same connection, web property, and view. And again, I'm going to choose to pull data from last week, as of today, all at once. I don't need a segment, but in this case, I am going to choose a dimension, which will be page. And then I'm going to choose my same set of metrics, users, sessions, page views, and bounce rate. In this case, I am going to use features on the Advanced tab. I'm going to sort my data by adding a sort. I'm going to sort it by users, and I'm going to choose to sort by users descending. I'm not going to filter this data, but I am going to add a post-processor to it. I have a URL or path-based dimension in this data export. So I'm going to choose that by clicking the Add URL button, and I'm going to choose to aggregate those paths. What the aggregate post-processor does is takes multiple URLs or multiple paths which have query parameters on them, that is the variable set after the question mark in a URL, and rolls them up into individual pages without the query parameters. So in this case, if I have multiple pages that represent the home page but with different query parameters on them, and I want to view those all as a single page, I can choose the aggregate post-processor and it will roll those up into a single page. I can also choose to limit the number of rows. In this case, I'm going to do the top 25 pages. We're not going to touch the formatting options, but they allow you to choose the sampling precision of your data export. Some of the layout options in terms of how your time intervals will appear if you're choosing multiple intervals, or you can schedule your data export to be delivered to you by email on a regular basis. In this case, we're going to leave those alone. Click OK to save our data export. And now that it's being created, it populates in our reporting event editor. And we're going to choose some details about how this reporting event is going to take the data from that data export and pull it into Excel on a regular basis. We've already selected our spawn cell, which is H1, on the data worksheet. And in this case, I'm going to choose the replace direction for my spawn details. This means that every time that I refresh this report, the data export will run and replace the old data with the new data. Now, I've put a limit on this data export, which is used by this reporting event. It's limited to 25 rows. But consider the case where in 1 week, only 5 unique pages were viewed on my site. That's unusual, but it can happen, or we might be dealing with a different metric where we might not know the number of rows that are going to appear for our chosen dimensions or metrics. In that case, I just click the Enable on Smart Interval, and the Smart Interval feature will know how big my previous export was, and it'll always replace the appropriate amount of data. I'm going to choose to include my column headers and click OK to save this reporting event. I'm going to save the list of reporting events, click on this new one, and click Run. So no errors occurred. I can close my list of reporting events. And you'll see that my pages report is now available here. So now what I would do is update the top pages report to refer to my data tab. Now, I've created data exports for the 2 pieces of this report. I've created reporting events that will pull data in. Now, every time that I want to refresh this report, all I need to do is click the Run Events button to run all of the events in the report. When I do so, the Smart Interval feature for each of these reporting events is going to recognize how much data needs to be pulled and refresh the data accordingly. You'll notice that now that I've completed the generation, if I move to the bottom, no new data has appeared in this table. That's because Smart Interval recognized that I already had the appropriate number of intervals pulled, and it didn't need to pull any new data. Once we get to next week, a new row of data will become available, and Smart Interval will pull that data if I run my report. So you can click Run Events as many times as you'd like, and it's not going to add extra data to your report. However, the Pages report did refresh because it's not an interval-based report, and it replaced the entire table of data. That'll happen again every week when I run this report. And I can just hide my data tab, leave my presentation layer the way it is, and deliver this report on a weekly basis. So in this tutorial, we looked at how to create a refreshable report with Reporting Manager. We looked at creating data exports, which live in the cloud, linking those data exports to our Excel workbook using reporting events, using the Smart Interval feature to pull historical data into our report and to define when new data needs to be pulled into our report. And we looked at how to refresh that report on a weekly basis. Have a look at the documentation and tutorials that are available in the Support Center to see more features of Reporting Manager in action.